Okay. Hello, everyone. We are now streaming live. Let me just stop the studio mode. Oh, and we're ready to go. So we have with us Mark, and we have actually been discussing amongst ourselves, how do we pronounce your last name? We have money on the table. There's things are at stake here. How do you pronounce your last name?
Well, it depends on where you're in Germany, where my ancestors were from. So my great-grandfather, when he came to the United States in 1848, wanted everybody to pronounce the name Juergensmeyer, the way
Okay.
it's pronounced in German. So he put an E after the U to try to force Americans to pronounce the U as U. So how successful do you think that was?
Not successful at all. I think people call you. I believe people.
No, he needn't have bothered. So everyone here just says Juergensmeyer. I'm happy with Juergensmeyer.
Juergensmeyer? Okay, Mark Juergensmeyer. You're wrong, Thomas. Anyhow.
All right.
So while looking you up, we've noticed that throughout your career, you have extensively researched and wrote about religious violence. What was it that sparked
Right.
your interest? What happened throughout your life that got you to that place to begin with, that made you just fascinated and profoundly interested in this topic?
Well, I've always been interested in the relationship between religion and politics. So my PhD is in political science, but I also have a background in religion. And then I lived for a number of years in India. And in India, all religion is political and all politics is religious. So it was just a great kind of field day for somebody interested in religion and politics. So in the 1980s in India, in the Punjab, which is the area of India that I lived in, it began a spiral of radical separatist movement led by Sant Jarnal Singh Bhindranwale against the Indian government, which, as you may recall, led to the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. And then just a great calamity of violence throughout northern India. And I wanted to understand why. Because after all, these kids mostly were kids, young Jat-Sikh men from rural Punjab, who were part of this violent movement. And by violent, I mean they kidnapped people, they slaughtered set fire to whole busloads of Hindu pilgrims. They hijacked an Air India plane leaving Canada for India. There was just a horrible series of really terribly violent incidents. So I wanted to understand why, and what did religion have to do with it? So that was my first attempt to try to make sense of what I call religious violence, by which I mean not that religion causes violence, but violence that is in some way related to religion. And since then, of course, I've taken my show on the road in a sense. I've looked at other instances in South Asia and around the world, in the Middle East and in Japan and now, of course, in the United States and Europe, wherever religious violence occurs, often in association with the rise of religious nationalism, which is an associated problem. And I try to put all of this into global perspective. That is, to understand it not just as a single phenomenon, but why is this happening around the world? And why is it happening at this particular moment of late modernity, this particular moment of history? So that's been my project for the last 30 years or so, with a whole series of books that focus on the generic problem of religious violence throughout the world.
That's very interesting, because I know India right now is probably seeing a resurgence of that with the rise of the BJP and the is it RSS or RA? I don't what is the acronym for the party that influenced the BJP?
The RSS.
The RSS, yeah.
Yeah, well, Russia Slavic Song,
Yeah.
which is a movement that's been around for years, and it's out of this almost religious order that many of the leaders of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, have come, including Modi.
Yeah. What are the similarities between when you were in India? Do you reckon, and today, are there similarities? What are the trends that, other than just nationalism, what other trends are there to religious violence that you see, specifically in India?
Well, in India, from early in the India's independence movement, there has been a kind of a movement allied with, the Gandhian Congress Party, which is the great secular party that tried to bring together all the different religious groups in India and or South Asia under one banner of interreligious secularism. But associated with this, from the very beginning, has been a movement to have a religious nationalism, to have an India for Hindus. And it's this strain that I think so it kind of excited the fear among Muslims that led to a demand for a separate Muslim state. And then out of this, we get the emergence of Pakistan and Bangladesh as separate Muslim nations within South Asia, which, to my mind, was a tragic occasion because it then set forth the whole pattern of religious-based national organization, which I think has serious problems, as we've seen, both in Pakistan and to some lesser extent in Bangladesh, and now increasingly in India. So this has been a strain that has been a part of the dynamics of Indian politics since the 1920s for a long time. Why it's emerging now and with such force, I think, is a different question.
Okay.
That, I think, relates in some way to globalization, which is a topic I hope we get into.
Oh yeah, let's definitely get into
Oh
globalization.
yeah, definitely.
100%, because
Yeah.
in your one of your most notable books is the global rise of religious violence, right? Tearing the mind of God. You have this notion of cosmic war. Does that relate to this at all? To this concept of globalization? Can you expand on that, or?
Well, it doesn't relate so much to the concept of globalization, which is, I think, is part of the dynamics that lead to the social and political disruption that leads to the rise of religious nationalism. But it does help explain the role of religion in movements like this, because, as I said, religion doesn't cause this violence, and I say that to correct the misunderstanding that some people have attributed to my work, because they simply see the phrase religious violence and they say, "Oh, Juergensmeyer says religion causes violence." No, I don't say that.
Yeah, no.
I don't
exactly.
say that. What I say is that violence happens, and then violent actors often find religion to be a very convenient form of mobilization. And it's a convenient form of mobilization in various ways. And one thing, just in the social makeup, let's take ISIS, for example, which is an extremist group that we often associate with religion. But when I go to Iraq and Syria, which I have many times, and talk with followers of the ISIS movement, including those I've interviewed in prison who are actually hardcore followers of ISIS, what I found is that, yeah, they clothe this in religious language, but they all begin with the social issue, the issue that Sunni Arabs, that's in their community, are being excluded and left out by those Shia Arabs who are in charge. It's a social conflict between two social groups, between the Sunni Arabs and the Shia Arabs. And then religion comes in as a kind of an attempt to explain all this and also to rile people up. And so the religious rhetoric of ISIS is the one that points to this cosmic war, a great battle between good and evil and right and wrong. And so you have to, come on, get on board. We're going to really show them. And this is what excites actually a lot of young people, particularly the young people in Europe and other places who flock to Syria and Iraq to join the movement. The kind of image from computer games, this kind of global battle that they can act out in real life. This kind of cosmic war. It's a thrilling notion that you're in a war for existence itself. You're a war that'll save all civilization. And the other side is just demonic. It's like, the computer game Fortnite where the enemies are zombies. Well, it's the same thing.
Do you think...
imagine all the Shia Arabs are zombies. Well, it's fair game to kill them. That cosmic war plays, and that's at the other end of the spectrum. begins with the as globalization, a sense of unrest about who we are and what we are as a national community, and that's course, radically changing in an era of easy communication, an easy demographic shift where everyone can live everywhere and does. And so in this context, who are we as a national community? We ask, people in the central part of the United States where I grew up in a farm in southern Illinois, they're asking that question, and they kind of lead to a MAGA, politics.
Yeah.
And, people in Iraq or Syria may lead to an extremist form of Islam as a way of saying, okay, come on, we've got to make our country safe for Muslims again.
Yeah.
They've got to make Iraq great again by making it pure for Muslims. Well,
evangelical Islam.
That's a good way to look at it. What makes me interested is we talked about like this identity of national identity as like being as a primer for this type of religious violence. Do you see the MAGA movement and their lack of national identity as the bubbling up of that?
Sure, to some extent, yes, absolutely. Also has religious characteristics. I've looked a little bit at January 6th and the Proud Boys and some of the other groups associated with that uprising, and the way they use religious symbols. And there are pictures of Jesus wearing a MAGA hat coming to January 6th. And there are all these T-shirts that are anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish, for that matter. But 7 million is not enough, meaning Holocaust didn't kill enough.
God.
Yeah, horrible, exactly. But it kind of indicates the idea of social identity, the importance that we true Americans are Protestant, Christian, heterosexual, male-dominated Americans. Hell with all those other people.
the plutocratic patriarchy, right?
So how do you think that this sense of identity that is so important, like as it begins to break down with globalization, because obviously I think we saw a similar nationalistic movement before the Great Wars, World War I and World War II. There was a big nationalistic movement, and people have said there's mirroring effects today. What are some of the lessons about like rebuilding that identity that maybe we can try to make or like put into action so we don't repeat those horrors of the past in a way?
Don't repeat history. Yeah,
that's a good question.
And
there's no and a hard one. That's right, because there are no simple answers. And the one thing that really made a difference during World War II was having a common enemy, and then, despite the ethnic cleansing that marginalized Japanese Americans, for example, there was still a sense of common purpose. And whether there is something, and maybe global warming will provide this. Increasingly, everyone is becoming aware that we have messed up the planet to a degree that's, it really is an existential threat. And maybe that will serve as a kind of common thing to say, look, despite our differences,
we've got a common enemy to fight. Yeah,
exactly. But I think it would have to take something like that, because, for those of us who live in California, or in my case, half California, half the year in California, half the year in Hawaii.
Lucky, by the way, very lucky. Hawaii is beautiful. That's just what a way to live.
Lucky.
Half the year in Hawaii, half a year in California. Right, just chase the sun,
But lucky in a number of ways. It's also because of the people, the diversity of the people in both California and Hawaii. So we're used to being around a diverse culture and people from different parts of the world and living happily together. And from my point of view, enjoying the food from all over the world.
Yeah.
I mean, when you live in LA, you can get really good Vietnamese pho in Westminster. You can go to Monterey Park and get some of the best Chinese food. I mean, just the diversity of Filipino, Indonesian communities, and wonderful Mexican food and other South American food in LA. So we reap gastronomically the benefits of globalization.
Oh yeah, I love globalization for the very fact I love food. I mean, it's clear, but I literally travel just for food.
Yeah.
That's like my main thing. Trying different ethnicities, different cuisines. You too, Thomas? Yeah, of course.
I like food.
But we moved away from the main. We moved away from the main.
No,
thrust
jump
of it.
back in, Dandan. It's okay.
I forgot what it even was. Oh yeah, we talked about.
You were asking about the world wars, and you were asking about what can we see about all of that leads to nationalism.
Oh
What
yeah,
led to
the common
nationalism
enemy. That was the thing. The
before
common
two
enemy.
wars?
Yeah, the common enemy part.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
one thing, but also just to enjoy, to not feel defensive about the way the world is becoming, but to enjoy it and to see how beneficial it is for our way of life. I think that can also come to Middle America, because even in the little farm town that I grew up in, I'm still connected with that farm town. My brother lived there until he died fairly recently. I still have property there. I still go there. I go to the high school reunions, which is interesting, and I'm surprised. I'm surprised at the number of people who agree with me. That is, who see the world differently, and that the very loud-voiced MAGA supporters, while quite a few, and of course, and dominate the politics of the region, are by no means the unanimous voice, and so that gives me a certain amount of hope that, and particularly among the young people, that there is a sense of transition to a more open and interesting world than the one that they've known, that their parents have known before. So that gives me some hope for the future also.
I was
I
very.
want to think that's the case for everywhere, but I live in Alabama, so I don't know. I always have to make a joke about Alabama, but no, I agree with you entirely about what you said.
I had a lot of hope.
But even in Alabama, I've known some really great people from Alabama, so don't.
Oh yeah, me too. It's just the ethos. You know what I mean? It's that overall ethos that's got a little bit of growing to do, a little bit of kid stuff to grow out of, I guess.
Right.
I was very hopeful.
Go ahead,
That was true even when I was a kid. I remember when I was a little boy, there was billboards outside the town that said "Impeach Earl Warren," and there was a John Birch Society was very popular. So this has been a common motif for rural America, and I think it's significant that the politics of the country now is almost, you can just chart it demographically between rural and urban America.
Yeah.
And I think that says volumes about as you say, the ethos in which it characterizes this patchwork of culture within the United States and its political consequences.
Yeah.
Where does that
For sure.
where does that divide, do you think, comes from? This like rural urban divide, other than just like way of life and how they live, but there seems to be a lot more to it. Like we hear, rhetoric that mirrors like lost cause argumentation, as if, and I hear a lot of people say it's a failure of Reconstruction from the Civil War. Does that resonate? Does that make sense? Or do you have a whole different idea of where this divide comes from, and especially when it comes to having like an identity, a national identity in a sense?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think the failure of Reconstruction may be more of an issue in the South than, let's say, Southern Illinois, the area that I've come from. And I can certainly say this is simply anecdotal, but talking with my classmates who are, stridently anti-woke, for example. Mm-hmm. And so I have to say, they want to say, are you a supporter of woke? I said, I have no idea. What on earth does it mean?
Good answer.
What is woke? And I said, the word simply means awake. And to my knowledge, it was only used in the context of being awake to the injustices of through inequity in the country, and I don't see that as a huge issue.
I think the woke is used today in the same way that like, you know, things like Bolshevik media was used in like the 1920s or something. It's just a name for specific ways of thinking, or when they, inclusion in television, they just call that woke, or anything that has to do with gender identity, they'll call that woke. It's just a placeholder for I don't like that, is how I think woke is being used. It's almost like a signifier for like an in-group.
And then the question is, why don't they like that? Why? Because it seems
Yeah.
to most of us just a matter of equity and justice. But I think to my old high school colleagues, they see it as a matter of inclusive and exclusiveness. They see it as signaling a party to which they have not been invited, and they see these wonderful multicultural images on television and the movies that originate on the East or the West Coast that does not seem to include them. And so they feel that they are the forgotten flyover people who are not honored, not appreciated, and not included.
That's what my parents think, Mark. Is they don't think anybody gives a damn about their votes. They're hyper conservative evangelical Christians, very good people, but they think very much that their votes are thrown in the trash.
Yeah.
Sad.
And that's because they see that the dominant culture, and it's true, it is the dominant culture in the United States, is much more progressive. I mean, just look at the percentage of people who support abortion rights. It's just off the charts. It's something like 70%, and that includes Republicans and Independents. So, they are in the minority, and they feel excluded minority, and that's the shame, of course, because from my perspective, I keep on telling them how lucky you are to live in this small town. Do you realize how much that real estate that you own, that little house that you bought for $100,000 would cost in Santa Barbara, and you couldn't touch it for $1 million?
Correct.
Yes. You're right.
Living like a king.
I mean, I live in New York, and everything is just so expensive.
You're dead right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
It's interesting that you say that. Go ahead.
They're living the good life. They're getting the cream of the crop for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that we talked about like identity. It seems like they feel like their identity isn't represented in what they're seeing, in what they're hearing, in the public discourse. All they see, it's almost, and I guess as a way of reasserting that identity, right? They're constructing this idea of who they are. As separate to, as better, as unique. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the interesting thing, this now comes back to my larger project, the global project. This is true of every single one of the movements that I've studied. This is true of ISIS. This is true of the Bindenwali movement. This is true of the Israeli and Palestinian movements on both sides, religious violence, where they feel that they've been left out. This is true of the moral movement of Mindanao in the Philippines. It is a common pattern throughout the world of angry, violent people who are asserting what they feel is they feel like there's been a war against them. And their assertions of violence is simply a recognition of that, acting out of that war and trying to reclaim a public space. And through acts of terrorism, for example, I'm particularly interested in that phenomenon. What I talk about that in the book that you referred to is performance violence. It's a way of asserting, at least for a moment, they're in charge. So these are nobody people up in the caves in Afghanistan who feel like Muslims in general, and they in particular, have been left out. And they blow up the World Trade Center and put a hole in the Pentagon, and suddenly the world's attention is on them. They are.
Yeah.
That's the image, and that image of war, that there is a violent struggle, which is what they've felt for years, is acted out in that performance of violence, which we see as terrorism. And so in that moment, they feel vindicated and glorified, and they feel empowered. It's of course a fading sense of power. It's an illusory sense of power. not real power, but it gives the illusion of power, at least for a time, that propels them and gives strength to the movement. And this is true of the United States as well, and why some fringe aspects of the right-wing movement are indeed violent. We saw that in January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you've been talking about this for like forever. It seems
I'm very glad that it's a minority.
Yeah, me too.
So,
me too.
I'm sorry,
me
Dandan.
too. It's okay. I end up just jumping ahead. You can just talk over me sometimes. But to me, this seems like easy. This seems matter of fact. When I was introduced these ideas, I see them right away. I mean, I grew up in Israel. I moved here when I was 10, and I'm very connected. So like everything you say, I would 100% agree with you. That there is a sense of in-group and out-group from both sides, and it's just they're just trying to consistently find an identity. But why is it so hard to communicate to the public? Why is it so hard? Like, what are the challenges like you have faced or other of your peers faced, like of communicating this idea to people to try to have them step away and like see what's going on?
What idea?
I
didn't quite follow you.
The idea that really what we're doing here, that these violence, they're not necessarily just ideologically based. It's not because they have a certain religion or it's not because they have a certain culture, but rather it's this type of like identity assertion or this idea of they're trying to...
A cry for recognition.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, because when you've been injured, you don't care what the reasons are for the injury. You focus on the victimhood. And so the nation's response to 9/11 was not, why are these people doing these things, which of course is what I ask immediately, and particularly in my case, since I had interviewed people who were involved in the earlier attempt to blow up the World Trade Center. It's the same cast of characters.
Yeah.
So I knew exactly who they were, and I had a good idea of why they did that. But the general response of the public, including of politicians, and now we're talking about George Bush and the neocon administration that he was a part of, was to get back at those bastards, to find them and destroy them, to take them on, and launched his own war on terror, which was, from the point of view of Al Qaeda and the extremists, remarkably successful. They goaded the United States into thinking about the world the way they thought about the world, as a world at war. That was their image. And through this act of performance violence, they were enormously successful in getting the United States to then see the world at war, which was the whole point of the act in the first place. Now, it didn't lessen the violence. In fact, if anything, it encouraged it. And so terrorist acts as a result increased, not decreased, as a result of the war on terror, until eventually it withered away, in part because of the resistance to it, the military resistance, but only in part. This most recent book I've done, When God Stops Fighting, is an attempt to look at how terrorist movements end.
Okay.
And so I look at several case studies, and I've spent 5 years going to ISIS. It was one case study, to the Bhindranwala movement in India, which is the first one I studied, and the Moro movement in the Philippines, 3 case studies. And what I found in all of those cases was that the attempt of the police and the government resistance to them was not the main thing that destroyed them. They all were destroyed from within. They simply collapsed from within, mostly through infighting, through struggles. It's very hard to maintain when you don't have discipline. You don't have a disciplined army. It's very hard to maintain a sense of purpose, that romantic image of cosmic war, and particularly as 17, 18-year-old guys, turn into their late 20s and early 30s, and they ask why they're doing all this, and there's jockeying for power, and you get the kind of stuff that you're seeing in the Russian army right now. Things are not going well. They're fighting with each other, and it just falls apart from within. And that's invariably the case. And then the coup de grace is often delivered by the opposing army or police. And that's the point at which police action can be effective, because the movement is already, basically dead. So they are able to destroy it. But at an earlier moment of the movement, when the movement is strong, the same kind of police violence is actually counterproductive because it then can excite and mobilize the movement and make it even more vigorous than it was before. So it's this business about police resistance and using violence to stop violence is a very tricky thing. I mean, Indira Gandhi discovered that when she okayed the raid on the Golden Temple to kill Bhindranwale, and of course it led to her own death. And the same thing happened in mentioned Israel when the attempt to try to destroy Hamas by killing Sheikh Yassin, whom I had interviewed, interestingly.
Very interesting.
And thought that would destroy Hamas. Well, Hamas emerged even stronger than before, and it was after that death that Hamas then had its electoral victories, initially in the West Bank and Gaza, and now still controls Gaza. So,
I have to ask,
armed resistance.
What was that interview like?
Yeah.
What was that interview like? How did you find him?
Interview Sheikh Yassin?
Yeah.
Well, it was a long time ago. It was early in the project, it was in the early 1990s, right after the first Intifada. And I was spending some time in Israel looking at both looking at extremist movements, Meir Kahane and the
Meir Kahane is out of his mind. Yeah.
Yeah, and now it's his grandson who is now kind of picking up the call as the leader of the Hilltop Gang, whom I've also talked with.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, it happens to be actually Meir Kahane's grandson.
Wow.
And so when I found that out, I was just bowled over because I'd interviewed the grandfather. But I interviewed Meir Kahane shortly before he was killed in downtown Manhattan by some of the same people I interviewed who were part of the early bombing of the World Trade Center.
That's crazy.
Mahmoud Al-Balima, who drove the getaway car for the...
Sounds like a bunch of mafias. Sounds like a bunch of mafias warring with each other, kinda.
Kinda, but they're... Right, but mafias that are that kind of, religious nationalism mafias. It's a certain kind of mafia.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm actually.
I've lost my train.
I'm just. For me, it's incredible. Like you've interviewed all of these people in positions of power in these movements. The person, the human. Like, what did you say about the human behind it? Like their charisma. Like, what is like a common thread between these people? Because when you said you interviewed, what was his name? The guy who was for the Hamas, Sheikh
Yassin.
Yeah.
Sheikh Yassin. Well, I mean, they're interesting. They're different. I mean, his right-hand man, the political leader, Dr. Rantisi, was a much easier person to interview than Sheikh Yassin. For one thing, Rantisi spoke some English. He was much more. He wasn't the charismatic leader as Sheikh Yassin. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Sheikh Yassin, they ushered me into this room. First of all, I saw he was wheeled out. He had this debilitating nerve disease, so he was in a wheelchair. And so they wheeled him out of. This was Khan Unit 1 in Gaza, where he lived. So I went to meet him, and I always went by myself, without anybody else, because I didn't want them to think I was, part of the government or police or
of course
whatever. I was just an academic. So I went by myself, but then because I don't speak Arabic or Hebrew, I would have to have a translator of some sort go with me, or I would pick one up there. In this case, I picked one up, asked if somebody spoke English could help. So it was one of their people who was the translator. And so that was, so it didn't look like I was coming with
exactly to get intel or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah, right. So I watched him, wheeled out. It was like a series of rooms, kind of like a motel, with a series of rooms. And so he was wheeled out of one room and down the causeway or the patio to another room. And it was a kind of performance room. It had like a dais where they propped him up on a bunch of pillows so he wouldn't fall over, and then everybody gathered around. So this was conversation with the foreigner. That was the topic of today's meeting. And, I'm in trouble. You can ask any question. Oh, good. All right. How did Hamas begin? I thought it was a simple question. Let us go back to the Quran. I said, oh, no.
That's interesting, though, they grounded in theology that way.
Yeah, exactly. So everything was really the basis of a religious discourse. But occasionally he would say something, and I wanted quotes, I wanted something I could use for my project. So occasionally he would say something that was striking. And so at one point when I was trying to talk about, the difference between the PLO and Hamas, he said that Palestine would never be free until it is an Islamic Palestine. And that kind of summed it up. And that's a quote from him I've used quite a bit. But it wasn't a very fruitful interview otherwise, other than to see the way he appeared. I mean, he appeared as, I've seen gurus in India. I lived in India for a while. I'm used to gurus. I'm used to, holy men being propped up on a dais and a big crowd coming around and they pontificate and everybody kind of is there to get their blessing. And that's what it reminded me of, that it was more of a kind of a religious, he was a kind of a charismatic religious leader more than a strategic a strategigizer. Dr. Rantisi was certainly a strategizer. He was totally different. Him was, of course, he adored Sheikh Yassin. There was a picture of him and Sheikh Yassin up on his wall, the two of them together. Clearly he adored the man, but he was the practical one, and he had his interview was extremely interesting and very useful because he talked about very specific things, and he answered my questions in very specific ways. For example, when I asked him, I said, how do you, this business of using suicide attacks, which when I was there was quite common in the 1990s. He said, Israel has one of the largest armies in the Middle East. That's really not going to put a dent in it. It's just annoying people, but it doesn't really strategically change anything. And then he looked at me kind of like he was looking at a small child, and he smiled benignly. And he said, well, maybe not in my lifetime, or maybe not in my children's lifetime, or even children's lifetime. But in my children's lifetime, we might succeed, because this is not our war. This is God's war. And that was such an illuminating insight.
That's chilling.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah,
that's
and it told me about the power of cosmic war, thinking in religious terms, because then the timeline of the struggle is forever. And you can endure what look like setbacks, because ultimately you will reign victorious, because this is not your war. It's not a human war.
It's a holy
God's
war.
That was. Yeah, so that was a very illuminating, and I learned that from Rantisi. But from Sheikh Yassin, it was the other thing interestingly I learned from Sheikh Yassin was simply pictures in his room. I did go to his room and had tea, and we just the two of us, and we talked a little bit. But again, it was in these kind of he would pontificate rather than have a normal conversation. But up on his wall, there were two pictures, and one was a picture of it showed the Quran opened with two hands, as if the Quran had hands spanning from Morocco to Indonesia. So it was kind of
showing the scope of it, like how much the Word of God has influenced the world in a way. Okay.
Yeah. This was the Muslim world. And the other picture was the Dome of the Rock, the third most sacred site in Islam, which happens to be located on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So those were the two. I took those to be the two foci of his interest, and one is Palestinian nationalism, which was symbolized by the Dome of the Rock, and the other was a kind of a global Islam, and seeing the conjunction between the two. Yeah,
It's as you say this, I couldn't.
But that was Sheikh Hasina.
As you said that, you said this is not a war for us; it's a war for our children. It's a war for God. I'm just literally thinking back to. I'm sure you know what Turning Point USA is, right? The far right organization that has like events. And I remember seeing, a Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene stand on stage and say, "Oh, America is a Christian nation. That's a good thing." And following her up were speakers talking about how the war against LGBTQ is a war for our children. These motifs are repeating themselves in a way, very, very, very strictly. I mean, I'm just,
essentially you're part of a larger struggle, and a struggle that will endure past your own lifetime. Now, the interesting thing is that same week that I was talking with Sheikh Yassin, I was also talking with Meir Kahane in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And I went with him to, in the Sheraton Hotel in downtown Jerusalem, we went to a big rally where he unfurled a flag that for the state of Judea, which is a state that was going to be created on any part of the West Bank that the Israeli government retreated from, because he felt that the West Bank was true biblical territory. And one of his lines that sounded eerily like Sheikh Yassin was that Israel will not become truly Israel until it's Jewish Israel and biblical Israel. And by biblical Israel, he meant it had to absorb the West Bank. And he said, again, like Sheikh Yassin or like Dr. Rantisi, he said, this may not happen in my lifetime. And of course, it turned out he was killed just a few months after that. He said, this may not happen in my lifetime, but eventually it will happen because this is God's will. So so you have two images on both. What a difficult battle this is when you've got both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, the image of at least religious activists who see this struggle in cosmic terms. Now, fortunately, most Palestinians don't see it that way. Most Israelis don't see it that way. I mean, there is, in fact, these are extremist groups. They have disproportionate influence politically in both Palestine and Israel right now, especially in Netanyahu's government. But they're not the majority positions. Like the United States, they're not the majority.
They're not the majority positions.
Very loud, very potent minority.
They're a very loud minority. Yeah, absolutely.
Go
ahead, Dandan.
Naively, when the war in Ukraine began, I thought, oh, here it is. We have a thing we can unite over. We're gonna be, because for the longest time that I can remember, I'm a lot younger. When you were interviewing Meir Khan in Israel, I was still just like figuring out how to walk. So, I was.
I'm older than you think I am.
I mean, aren't you? You are 83 years old, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Joe Biden's also 83-year-old. You guys,
you're doing really good, my friend.
I mean, amazing.
You're doing really good.
Yeah. Right.
What was I saying? I naively thought, I remember the right wing of the United States always talked about Russia. Russia bad, Russia the enemy. I've been thinking back to like images I know about the way Republicans in the 80s and talked about Russia. But for some reason that didn't matter. And that dumbfounded me. And I lack the ability to understand that. Why do you think that wasn't able to give us a sense of like, oh, there's an enemy. Russia's an enemy. They're invading Ukraine. Why did that just not work? Or like, I just don't. I was naively thought that, and I just feel dumbfounded that none of that happened.
Why is it not a unifying force?
Yeah,
is that what you mean?
I think so.
Why was it not like a unifying motivator for that action to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the way in which the Republican Party has turned into the party of Trump. And I think Trump is the answer to that. I mean, his own friendship with Putin, his own friendship with Russians has helped to kind of change the image, and also the embracing of autocratic power, embracing of non-democratic autocratic power in the United States, which of course is symbolized by Trump, and the fact that great numbers of his followers seem to be totally untroubled by the fact that he made up this idea that there was voter fraud, and ignored the fact that he played a formative role in January 6th. It's just astounding.
Yeah, I mean, he's got like 21 credible assaults of he has 21 credible sexual assault charges, not charges, but allegations, and he still made it into the White House after saying and doing all that. I mean, he could probably get away with anything by now, just among his minority. I thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, and that's his own stance. He could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and he would get away from scot free. And there's been a certain truth to that, unfortunately. So this idea of the great leader, it's a trope, it's a pattern in a lot of movements, and almost a deification of a leader in a way that give people a point of identity, and particularly when they feel there's an uncertainty about which way a nation is moving, and they feel uncertainty about the society around them. To see a strong leader, a powerful leader, even if it's a corrupt person, but at playing this kind of almost divine role. And as we know that gods can do all kinds of things, traditionally the image of gods sporting with in different ways, and this is certainly true in India. With the gods, with having their mischievous little sexual activities, but they're gods; they can get away with that, and so can these kind of godlike public figures. And this is true of the followers of Bolsonaro and the followers of Modi. It's followers of Erdogan. So there is a kind of a great leader pattern that Trump fit into, and fortunately,
that autocratic streak.
Yeah, exactly, and they don't care; they'll always follow it. And fortunately, it seems to be kind of stuck at 30%, which I think is, as it stays at that percentage, should give us some comfort.
That should.
Yes.
Are you? What's one of the things that has surprised you the most about contemporary politics, outside of just like Trump? Because I think that's an obvious one. But like when you look at like the global sphere, what's like one thing that is surprising you that you didn't expect to see, or that seems novel and unique? Because it seems to me like you have a pretty good grasp on all this. It's just like, oh yeah, of course this is how this works. This is how this works.
Well, when I started this project in the early 1990s, actually I started this project in the 1980s because I was looking at the Sikh movement. I saw it largely as and I wrote about this in my first book, a kind of unfinished project of nationalism, of new nations. It seemed to me a problem of the Middle East and South Asia, and I didn't expect and didn't see it as a major problem for Europe and the United States fairly recently. And so what I've seen here is the kind of troubling phenomena of this same sort of political and religious extremism coming to Europe and the United States. And that surprised me. And I, of course, had to rewrite some of my books as a result. I put out a whole new edition of Terror in the Mind of God that now includes many more case studies from Europe and the United States.
Do you feel like Orban was kind of like the prototype for that great like religious national leader, or in the modern times? Or
sure, he's one. Yes, he's sure one. He's certainly one example, and an interesting one in that, like many of these figures, including Trump, in an earlier stage of their political career, they were really quite moderate or even progressive. And then when they got a taste of power and they saw that they needed to kind of shift their public persona to appease a larger crowd, and they kind of took over this theatrical role of great leader, which it is a theatrical role. And to watch Trump in action, in front of a crowd is really quite a sight. I mean, he is a remarkably charismatic figure. He's totally confident in front of a crowd, and
He
he has.
somehow hits all the right boxes for those kinds of people. I don't know why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And just there's, he has them and they have him. It's just an incredible sight to
Yeah.
see. And so Orban, discovered the same thing, and probably, as you say, earlier than Trump. But it's a
Yeah.
common phenomenon in this kind of deification of a leader, when the leader himself, and it's usually him. There are very few women playing this role. Take on this, take on to themselves this aura of divine sanction.
Now,
Has there ever been a female demagogue, autocrat?
Well, you've got me stumped. Yeah, I'll have to think about it. None immediately comes to mind, but I'm sure there must be.
There has to be, but I can't think of one either.
But you're right; it tends to be more of a guy thing.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
That's also true.
You know why? That's because more narcissists are guys.
my wife would agree with you on that.
I mean, we can historically think of Cleopatra, right? Maybe Cleopatra was one of those leaders in the past. If we look back throughout history, I don't know.
Evita, I don't know. It's sort of, I can't.
Someone
there've been strong leaders. I mean, Indira Gandhi was also, but those who became particularly this kind of divination of a leadership, where they, of an ironclad autocrat. I can't think. It's hard to imagine.
People in the
it's harder for me to imagine. That's why I asked it.
People in the chats are saying.
Yeah, I had the same.
No, it's okay. There's lag. Continue.
No, I was going in a slightly different direction. I was going to say that in my book on Turn the Mind of God, I was looking at why guys tend to be terrorists more than women. And in the revised book, I really found only one woman I could put on the cover of this recent version of the book, and that came from the Gujarat riots, in which Modi was implicated, in which for years Modi was not allowed to travel in the United States or Europe. All that changed when he became prime minister, of course, and then lately Biden put on this huge triumphant state dinner for somebody who was regarded as a global terrorist just a few years ago. But that was a horrible situation where literally thousands of Muslims were hacked to death by a riotous Hindu mob. And one of the members of Modi's cabinet, Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, the state of Gujarat at the time. This happened in Ahmedabad, which is a large city in Gujarat. One of his cabinet members, a woman, health minister actually, was handing out machetes to try to urge people into battle. And so she was tried and convicted. God. She was tried and convicted for terrorism. So we have at least one woman who's verified as a terrorist.
Verified terrorist.
Verified terrorist, exactly. But I do have a section called "Why Guys Throw Bombs," trying to figure out why it's guys. Somebody accused me once of trivializing this topic by calling them guys. And I said, "Well, where we get the term? You know where we get the term guy? Do you know?"
No, I don't. Where do we get the term guy from?
A person. Now, what person named Guy? Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was the insurrectionist in Britain who was leading a terrorist attack. The British Parliament was going to attack the British Parliament and kill the king as a way of asserting power for Catholics that he felt was left out of the changing political, religious landscape in England. And eventually he was convicted and hanged. And so there's Guy Fawkes Day in England as a result of that, to show the triumph over this kind of terrorism insurrectionist. So the original guy was a terrorist.
I see. That's
so
cool.
We now apply.
Well, your intuition. I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a little bit of delay here, so forgive me. Your intuition that most of them are men is going to be correct, I think, because in terms of antisocial personality disorder, women are about approximately 1.5 to 2% of the world in terms of ASPD, and then men are anywhere between 6 and 8%. of the world in terms of
Interesting.
ASPD. So that's going to be
Yeah,
your
that's true.
Yeah.
psychopathy, your sociopathy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So the question is why? I mean, is there something biological? I mean, my wife regards testosterone as an evil hormone. She thinks
Do you
all
think
kinds of
testosterone is an
things
evil
that men
hormone?
do.
Do you think testosterone is an evil hormone?
I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociologist, so I look for social causes. And so the social cause is that men, in a traditional patriarchal system, assume roles of power, and they're the ones when things are going amiss socially, they internalize it as shame, as something that they should have done. It's their fault that things are going bad, and women don't have that sense of responsibility for public life because of the traditional male and female roles. That's my sociological answers. So the men and internalize it, experience it as shame, and I think nothing is more powerful than a feeling of shame that is powerful in leading to acts of violence or being dissed, in the words of rap music. If you feel like you've been dissed. If you feel like you've been dissed, being a guy, you do what guys do, just knock the crap out of somebody.
Yeah.
And you can do it through terrorist movements, you can do all kinds of things. But so that's my sociological explanation. But I'm sure there are many others, including the biological one.
I'm sure there. So
absolutely.
This like notion of being dissed, being shamed, I find it that like today, in like today's like political violence, we see, we a lot of people have coined like the myth of the lone wolf, in a sense, where it's not that these actors are lone wolves; they're actually a part of a broader scale. They're just not acting out of any like centralized figure. Does in your study of like religious violence, did you see that same type of behavior, or was it more violence that did come from a type of like structure and like group or whatever it is, as opposed to like lone wolf attacks where a specific individual would go out and like exercise this shame or notions of like national violence, religious violence on their own?
I think both are true. I mean, you can have collective shame. I mean, you can have a sense of a group that feels like the Sunni Arabs that I interviewed. They feel that somehow they are not exactly complicit in their own marginalization, but to feel that they didn't stand strong enough against Americans who are behind it. They blame Americans for doing this. I mean, after all, Bush was keen on bringing democracy to Iraq, and democracy means that the majority rules, and from the point of view of the Sunnis, that means that since the majority of people in Iraq are Shia, that means that Bush is endorsing Sunni marginalization.
Okay.
So the whole lesson lost. Democracy sounds good to us, but to Sunnis, it sounds like it's a conspiracy to keep them marginalized, which is why they...
Yeah, no separation of church and state to think about over there, right?
Exactly. I mean, they weren't crazy over Saddam Hussein largely because he was not religious. He was a secularist. He was a socialist, and so but they liked him in that he was, first of all, he was a Sunni, and so he was from their community, but also from their perspective, he treated everybody equally because he was secular, and he didn't have a bias. Of course, this was from a Sunni point of view. The Shia thought, of course, that he was biased towards Sunnis. And they immediately turned the tables, and then, the Sunnis felt left out. But so there is that collective sense of shame. But getting back to the lone wolf, in my experience, my studies, all of the so-called lone wolves that I've seen involved in terrorist acts feel like they are part of a larger community in some way. For example, when Anders Breivik in Norway attacked the he threw bombs in Oslo and then went out and attacked this camp of young people who were associated with a political party that was in favor of multiculturalism in Norway. So Andras Breivik was incensed, and he saw this as wokeism, I guess. No, he didn't call it that.
Yeah, same thing, different name.
Yeah, and then he attacked them and started killing these kids. It was just a horrible slaughter of young people in the camp. It took an hour or so for the police finally to get there and act. It was almost like the horrible tragedy in Texas where it took forever.
Yeah, Uvalde, right?
But he was a lone wolf, and he still felt as though he was a lone wolf, and he still felt as though he was a part of that religious extremist community, right?
Well, exactly, because he left behind a manifesto. And so there's a television network in Oslo, they're kind of equivalent of NPR, that context. I had just been to Norway and had just been interviewed by those people. So they sent me a copy of this manifesto before it was publicly known, and so I stayed up all night trying to read through this manifesto to figure out what clues it gave me towards why he did this. And the very title of it was is it 2083, and that was unusual until I realized that would be the anniversary of the Gates of Vienna, which is where the battle at the Gates of Vienna that kept the Muslims from taking over Austria and by implication Europe. So they were stopped in their tracks. In his mind, he was stopping the Muslim hordes from taking over Norway. And the whole manifesto was geared, that was posted on his Facebook page, and he had hundreds of Facebook followers. And so in his imagination, he was speaking to this huge crowd of people, this community, as if, and we all know how intimate Facebook friends are with us, which is like not. Yeah. But in his mind, he was speaking to this large community, and it kept on talking about this, being the leader of a new movement, and a kind of Knights Templar movement in Europe that would fight against Islam. And so in his mind, he was a part of this larger movement. And there have been actually people who picked up on him, and the attack in Christchurch that was done in replication of what he had done. So, I mean, it's true. They did have some of these connections, but never the large mass of followers that he had imagined that he had.
I was going to bring up Christchurch because you said when you read that, you read a manifesto. Was there similar figures? We know that the Christchurch quoted directly political figures from like the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens as well. Are there similarities between like specific figures and talking heads that they end up quoting or appealing to in their manifestos? Well,
he seemed to be replicating Andras Breivik, I've got his name right now, the guy in Christchurch. Mm-hmm. So clearly he was aware of this, and to some sense he was following the same pattern.
Did Andras Breivik have like yes. So like what were do you remember what some of the political or like the pundits that Breivik was talking about that influenced his work, or he didn't really mention them? Because I found it unique that he specifically mentioned American right-wing pundits in his manifesto.
Yeah, he this is such a rambling manifesto. He threw in everything in there.
Okay.
including the syllabus of a course that was taught by one of my colleagues at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He taught a course on revolution. And so that was included in this manifesto. I saw with great amusement that one of my own colleagues figured his manifesto. Of course, my colleague had no idea, and he was really shocked and and immediately had to disclaim any kind of connection with this whatsoever.
That is terrifying.
But it was, yeah.
So the lone wolf incident seemed to be more of a mental health problem, is what it sounds like to me.
Well, it was part of it. But it wasn't lone wolf. That gets back to the point that you were making earlier,
right?
That there was a sense of being connected to that Dandan was making.
I'm sorry, my camera's not working. I'm going to get it to work again. Give me a second.
That's okay, Dandan. Sorry, Mark.
I apologize for this. Why is this happening?
Yeah, there's still a little bit of a delay between us two, so I apologize. Dandan, for some reason, it just keeps popping in and out on you.
No, my camera is just
Not
literally
yet.
saying that it's not working for some reason. Oh, there I
Yeah,
am.
now it says
I'm back.
connected.
I'm
Oh,
back.
now you're back.
I'm back. Okay. Sorry about that.
So you're Dandan, you're in New York right now?
Yes, I am. I am in New York right now. I live about 5 minutes away from JFK.
And then Thomas, you're in somewhere in California
Huntsville. I'm in Huntsville, Alabama.
right now. Oh my goodness! And I'm in Maui.
Unbelievable. Isn't that unbelievable?
We are. It really is. Well, I'm part of we have a global studies consortium. I've helped to create a field called global studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a consortium of universities around the world, and we have to meet occasionally. And so we had a recent meeting of people and the real problem was finding time zones,
Yeah.
a common time zone, because we had people from Auckland, from Shanghai, from Tokyo, from Delhi, from Cairo, from Aarhus, from Leipzig, London, and then East Coast United States, and I was I was actually in Maui at the time, so we literally had people all over the world trying to connect, and so some of us had to stay up till 2, and other people got up at like 6
I wonder the
o'clock in morning,
politics of
but
that, right? I wonder what the politics of that is like. I wonder what the politics of that is like. Who can pull the most? Oh no, my time is more important because there's more people or less people.
Well, this was just for our planning meeting for, we did have an international conference, but we had it in 3 different sections.
Okay.
And one was based in Tokyo, one was based at Aarhus in Denmark, and the other was based in Santa Barbara in California. So we could then appeal to the time zones, people in those congenial time zones in those areas. And then as many people who wanted to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, wherever they were, and join us. But
That's for them, I guess.
so it was kind of a traveling. It was like like a traveling party where you go from one house to the other. So.
Being in Maui, and I've never been to Hawaii, but what is they are obviously not mainland United States, and they must have their own identity. What is like the sentiments in Hawaii, in Hawaiian politics about what's happening in mainland United States? Is there any like what is a unique like? Is there anything unique there? Is there anything different that you pick up on, or it's just the same things that we will find in the news, or I could find here walking around the city, or whatever it is?
Well, both things are true.
Okay.
It is definitely a part of the United States, so people are interested in national politics, but there are also things that are distinctive to Maui and Mauian culture, a lot of it revolving around native Hawaiian rights.
Interesting.
And before, my wife and I came here several years ago after she retired from teaching, and I'm actually still teaching part of the year in California. But I'm semi-retired, so I felt that I could, come to Hawaii. I just lost my picture. How do I restore that? Go back to video.
Oh, we can see you. We can see you.
No, you're back. We can see you.
Yeah,
now.
but I can't see me, so I don't know what I did.
Can you see? Can you see us?
Well,
Interesting.
Huh?
You can see.
I don't see anything other than a bunch of circles of people.
There
audience.
might be a.
Speaker. Press the speaker thing. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there. Yeah.
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 Anyway, I was talking about Hawaii.
Nice.
So, but several years ago, my career in a nutshell, I taught at Berkeley for my first 15 years of my career, and then I went to the University of Hawaii for 4 years, and then to the University of California at Santa Barbara. So at the University of Hawaii, I went there to be the founding dean school at the university called the School of Hawaiian, Asian, and Pacific Studies. And it was, of course, I was an Asianist, having lived in India and studied India.
Mm-hmm.
It also included Pacific Island Studies and also included Hawaiian Studies. So I got to know quite a bit about the Hawaiian politics, and particularly working with the state legislature, since the university was the largest state institution, and so there's a lot of money in it, a lot of interest in it, and my school was seen as a possible way of developing new academic fields that would help to develop careers for young people in Hawaii that would get away from tourism and get more into global politics
That's awesome.
That's
and
really
global
cool.
communications. So
That's awesome.
yeah, it was a wonderful 4 years. So I got to know a lot about Hawaiian culture and society. And then, of course, partly for that reason, we decided, and my wife had also, as a graduate student, had gotten a degree in economics at the University of Hawaii. So both of us had a background in the islands, and so this seemed a natural place to come and spend half of our year. And I built
Yeah.
this place that you see in the background it's a bamboo house out of like a Polynesian design. It has no walls and no windows. It's just screens and open to the air, because you don't really need, you don't need air conditioning. You don't need to wall it things in. And it's on several acres where I have papayas and bananas and mangoes and guava and
Wow.
grow things. And it's right next to Io River, which comes from Io Valley. Comes out of the mountains, the West Maui Mountains down to Io Valley.
Sounds like a little slice of paradise.
It does. It does.
It is. Well, you can imagine the Marlon Brando figure from Apocalypse Now, and you kind of see the image that I'm trying to project. That was a joke.
I think that might be. I think that might be a little too old for me of a reference to know what you're talking about. I'm not enough of a movie buff.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now? You've seen Apocalypse Now. Come on.
I haven't seen Apocalypse Now. I really haven't seen Apocalypse
Oh,
Now.
my gosh. Yeah, Marlon Brando. I won't tell you. You'll see it.
Is it? Yeah, you can spoil it. Is it that? Is it?
It's modeled after the famous Conrad novel Heart of Darkness. And,
Okay.
so it's kind of a modern uptake of it.
Okay.
Anyway,
Yes.
but getting back to Hawaii, so there is a sense of kind of the uniqueness of Hawaii and the preservation of that uniqueness and its culture and its way of life and its language. The only state for which it has a second official language other than English. Hawaiian is the official language. When I bought this property several years ago, it went back to a land grant of King Kamehameha III. So all of the earliest documents are written in Hawaiian language. And in the church that I go to, which is interestingly largely a Filipino church, we sing a number of hymns written by Queen Liliuokalani, the last monarch who, before the overthrow, and the church itself was founded in 1865 by one of the Hawaiian kings whose pictures are enshrined in the stained glass windows. So there is a strong sense of the history of the islands. Most tourists, unfortunately, don't see that. They come here and they go out to the beach, and I've been trying to encourage some kind of tours, historical and cultural tours, to educate people who come here who want to see more than just the hula dances and the which are often very inauthentic hula dances, and want to just lie on the beach, but to see something about the culture and the history of what is just a remarkable place, and it deserves this preservation.
Like
Unfortunately, there's a strong movement towards preserving it. The politics are there's almost no Republican Party in the islands.
Okay.
It's strongly Democratic, kind of like California.
Kind of California. Okay.
Okay, so I'll be moving there soon. Just be ready for me.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
We are.
But the other reason I like it is it's wonderfully multicultural. Haole white people are in the minority. There's just another minority community. Probably the largest ethnic group would be now maybe Filipino or Japanese, Chinese. Traditional Hawaiian are a fairly large community, although they're so intermarried with other people, actually often intermarried with white people. So it's many of the native Hawaiian people are named Blaisdell.
So it's a real melting pot.
It's a real melting pot,
kind of like how America is supposed to be.
Exactly. And in general, people really get along. And, there is a certain matter of pride in ethnic identities, but since so few people are pure anything, and most people are kind of a mixture, it's a very, you can see how Obama would be raised in Hawaii and kind of feel like, everybody should get along, that there should be an easy interaction with the communities.
Well, we are as
And there's a tradition. Let me just say other thing about Obama.
Yeah,
which
for
is
sure,
true
for
of
sure, for
Hawaii,
sure,
which
for
I
sure.
like a lot.
Go ahead.
yeah. I'm loving.
And that is the.
I'm loving you, by the way. You're like my grandfather I never had. Honestly, like I want you as my grandpa, but that's okay.
Thank you, my son.
I
This has been an
am
excellent
honored.
conversation.
I am honored. I am honored.
But one nice thing about Hawaiian culture is that differences are to be mediated, and you never lash. You always sleep over any kind of strong feeling that you have. You don't immediately lash back, and so there's this strong sense of because the term aloha is not just a greeting, but it means, and it certainly means love, but it also means respect and dignity. So you could say, as I often do, I have a lot of aloha for Hawaii. It means I have a lot of loving respect for it, and so this is actually a motto that the state uses. Kukui your driving, be responsible for your driving. Drive with aloha. That means respect. Let the other person in your lane. Don't get aggressive. And you could kind of see this in Obama's approach to conflict and difficult situations. Just relax, take it easy. We can work this out. I like that spirit very much. It's one that I try to adopt.
What's the starkest difference that you see between where you grew up and where you live now? Like, or even in the way they used to think about the world. Right? I'm usually very curious about people's minds and how they have changed throughout life. And when you reflect back to your younger days, living in what was it, Indiana, right? If I get it right,
I lived in a little farming community in southern Illinois.
Southern Illinois,
not too far from St. Louis.
Yeah, in southern Illinois, and how you think of the world now, living in Hawaii. What could you say is the biggest change in your perspective about world, life, relationships, anything, really?
The interesting thing about this trajectory is that even though it seems so different, in a curious kind of way, it's come back, the circle has come back around again. Because when I grew up in this little farming community, part of a German immigrant community, actually. My grandfather came in the mid-19th century. But there was a kind of gracefulness about the small town living, and people got along. There was a sense of, acceptance of differences. I mean, admittedly, there weren't great differences. There were no black people in town, for example. There were no Asians. But we imagined huge differences between Catholics and Protestants, for example. My father, recommended that I never go. And so I had some Catholic friends. He said, you shouldn't do that because you may meet a Catholic girl and then want to marry her, and then, that would be horrible.
I still get that from my parents.
Out,
don't associate with non-Jewish people. Don't meet a non-Jewish girl and fall in love with her.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, in my case, I ended up marrying a Chinese Buddhist, which was unimaginable. I mean, I felt like saying, you should feel lucky it was a girl. It could have been worse from his point of view. Right. But there was a kind of a gracefulness to that small town living. Maybe it's magnified by my 70 or 80 years of perspective on it. But I think the kind of easygoing life of Hawaii and in general the multicultural acceptance of people here is really quite consistent with the pattern of easy living that I remembered as a kid growing up in southern Illinois. And what has changed in the difference is everything else. What's happened in America and what's happened in between. And so, at least in my case, coming to Hawaii in some way is coming home, coming full
amazing.
circle to
I like that.
a different set of life.
I love that. Well, to come full circle, we are
Yeah, it
unfortunately.
meets your small town sense of it. Yeah, I was about to say that too. I'm sorry, I was wrapping it up for you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm saying we are unfortunately at the end part of the interview. So while everyone is figuring out questions to come ask you, which everyone should figure out questions to come ask, I want to ask you, what is currently your favorite food that you're eating? Because you said that you love food, you travel. So what is it? Like, what is in Hawaii right now? What is your go-to meal? Like, if you could pick anything, what would it be? Well, people are gearing up to ask questions.
Steamed fish at a Cantonese Chinese restaurant is, high on our list, and that's partly because my wife is Chinese. But I also like poke. There's a kind of Hawaiian market here that's just famous for its poke. If you don't know what poke is, it's raw fish, mahi mahi or ono or opakapaga or ahi, and that's diced up and then mixed with flavors and sauces, and it's just scrumptious. And you eat it with crackers and with a nice cold beer. It's from Maui Brewing Company. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
Sounds great.
yeah.
So we got a question from Iffy who says, what is the most valuable lesson that you've learned from like your travels around the world doing interviews and stuff like that? What do you say is your most valuable lesson?
Oh, people everywhere are pretty much the same. They have the same diversity of wants and interests and fears and hopes that everyone else has.
And we have, I think, one more question from Mimi who asked, do you recall a time being fearful going to places to interview, or a time where you were genuinely scared for your life and well-being?
There were just a couple places. Now, interestingly, like when I went to see Sheikh Yassin, I didn't have any fear whatsoever because I was invited. I checked in advance, and he was expecting me. And so I had a taxi that took me. Actually, we had trouble finding his place, so we stopped at a university in Gaza City, which is known to be a hotbed of Hamas followers. And I thought, well, let's go there because they will know how to get to Sheikh Yassin. So we came roaring up to the gates of the university while all these young men were hanging out, kind of, fingering their guns and so forth. And so the taxi stopped too quickly, and I kind of half fell out of the back and picked myself up in the dust. And they looked at this strange American talking to them, asking how to get to Sheikh Yassin. And they said, "Why do you want to know?" And I said, "Well, I'm his guest." And they said, "Here's the telephone number you can call." And they, of course, immediately called, and it was confirmed. And so suddenly, I was their honored guest. I mean, then suddenly Arab hospitality took over, and whatever reservations they had about me were totally changed. So they all piled in the car. So then there were about 8 guys piled in this car, like 4 or 5 of us in the back, all scrunched together. And there was this one guy who was under my armpit. He kind of looked up at me and said, "You're American?" I said, "Yes." He said, "We hate Americans." I said, "Yes, I know." He says, "Where are you from?" I'm a professor at the University of California. He thought for a minute and he said, "Can you get me admission?"
Oh, I like that. That's funny.
Oh my God.
That's amazing.
So, but anyway, in most cases I didn't have problems, but there were a couple instances. Once, actually, the greatest one fear was when the Israeli. I was taking a picture of an Israeli kind of militarized vehicle in Gaza City, and they saw me, and they jumped out of the vehicle. They came racing over. They threw me down on the ground, and they grabbed my camera and started clicking pictures to make sure it was in fact a camera. And that was pretty scary. But it was the Israeli police that scared me, or no, it's not not the Palestinian extremists. And then there was a time fairly recently, actually, in Mindanao, where this town had been taken over by an extremist group of Mindanao militants who were associated with ISIS. And they took over the whole town and held it hostage, and then it was attacked and so-called liberated by the Philippines Air Force, which used American weapons, kind of busting bombs, that really it destroyed the town, but also destroyed the rebel group, except a lot of them were able to escape and go up into the hills. And I wanted to go there to find out, this was after the worst part of the attack was over, but just to find out what had happened, get the mood of the people there. But the problem is that the car had to go through rebel-held territory. And so my driver, who just is petrified, he says, if we get stopped, he says, they may take you out because they want to use you as hostage and make money. That's what they often did, would take a foreigner hostage, and if they didn't get any money, they would cut off his head. So and I kind of value my head, so I didn't want that to happen. He said, but me, in my case, they'll just take me out and shoot me. So he said, I don't want to be caught. So we were stopped at a roadblock by Filipino military, and so they looked at me and, who are you? What are you doing here? And we explained. And so then the next time we stopped, they said, that professor, they obviously had called ahead. So I just said to my driver, well, this is very lucky that they are calling ahead to the roadblocks, and that way, they will let us on through and everything will be safe. He said, yeah, if the roadblocks are in fact the Philippine military. And I said, oh, okay, I get it.
That's scary. Okay.
So as a result, he just flew like a bat out of hell. And
Wow.
I've never been in a car that's gone so fast on a shaky little road.
Wow.
At like 80, 90 miles an hour. He was going to waste any
Probably
time.
a smart move.
Yeah.
Very smart move.
But I got sick of it.
That's
But those are the scariest.
Man.
that's a lot of living. I'm quite envious of you with how much living you've done traveling. But what would you?
It's been interesting.
I mean, yeah, for sure. It's unbelievable.
Oh yeah.
What would you tell a young academic who's interested in global studies? Right. What advice would you give them?
Oh, pick a topic that you find important and engaging that will keep you interested for years. And think big. Try to find something that you think that has a lot of different perspectives that you can explore. Go for a large house, a mansion with a lot of rooms, rather than a bungalow when you're finding a research topic to focus on.
Yeah,
and enjoy.
Find something that's robust. I got you.
Yeah, and enjoy it. I mean, if you can't enjoy it, I mean, one of the reasons why initially my first dissertation project was on a religious movement of untouchables in northern India, in the Punjab, which had become politicized. And part of the reason for choosing that is that in order to find out about, these were untouchables. They didn't write anything. I had to go there and talk to people, and like old people, and get their oral history. And I did that deliberately because I didn't want to end up spending all my time in a library. I found libraries a little bit boring, and I, gregarious guy, and I wanted to go back to India, and I wanted to talk to people. So I found a topic that would allow me to do it. And I had a wonderful time doing it, and made friends that have been friends all the rest of my life. I've been in communication with some of them just this last week. So I'd say enjoy what you're doing. If you can't enjoy what you're doing, what's the point of doing it? And don't take graduate work as just something you have to put up with. If it's not enjoyable and interesting, it's not worth it.
And I think we have one more question. Again, it's Mimi again, and she's asked.
And then we need to wrap it up.
And then we just have to wrap it up, unfortunately. I have obligations.
Yeah, we want to let our guests have some breathing time.
Of course. So the last one is going to be this one. The question, and it's taking a dark turn. I wanted to leave it on a positive note, but the question is, what do you think has been the biggest cause for the increase in mass shootings in the United States?
Well, the prevalence of guns, of course. That's no mystery.
Yep.
It's just statistically obvious.
Yep.
And if you've got them, you can use them.
There's
no mystery to that at all.
Yeah, that's been my answer for a long time. So,
We don't think so, but there are people out there who disagree with us entirely.
Correct.
Sucks.
Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure having you on, and honestly, maybe another time you come on again, we'll do a different topic. We'll get you and someone also, another expert, to have a conversation. But fantastic. I really enjoyed speaking with you. I think Thomas has, and everyone's telling me that they love you in the audience. So.
I really enjoyed your personality.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed
incredible.
your personality, Mark. I really appreciate the insight that you've given me.
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation as well. You guys are fun to talk with.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, enjoy your beautiful day, and I'm going to go enjoy my evening. And thank you so much. I appreciate you, and keep going.
And come to Maui. We're always happy to see you. We'll give you aloha and a free Mai Tai when you see you at the airport.
Absolutely,
All
absolutely.
All right, we'll be there.
We'll be there.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You can just disconnect whenever
Goodbye,
you
my
want.
friend.
Yeah. He was awesome.
There we go.
He was
okay. Yes, very awesome dude. Very nice. Very good at the dialectic. You can tell he's talked to a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm. Very, very smart. Very, very knowledgeable. Well, I'm just gonna quickly end the stream, right? For everyone, this is what it was. It was wonderful. And as always, I have my little catchphrase: keep thinking. I do a little peace sign. Yeah.